But I would like to tell a different story that I learned in the course of my research. And that is just first an observation that the books that were available to this kid in southern Indiana were not very numerous or very impressive. But what was numerous was people on neighboring farms and in nearby towns. Lincoln took an interest in people. And even if the books were sometimes not very good, the people always were of interest to a future Democratic leader because so many of them would have the power of the vote.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this special American Inspiration event focused on the craft of writing history, presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society in partnership with the Massachusetts Historical Society, Porter Square Books, and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, producer of the American Inspiration Author Series and director of literary programs at American Ancestors, NEHGS. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at the ways and wisdom of President Lincoln and the craft of writing about our country, its past, and its people. Now, moving to introductions. He really needs little introduction, but I'm going to do this anyway. Steve Inskeep is a co-host of NPR's Morning Edition, the most widely heard radio program in the United States. He's also co-host of NPR's Up First, one of the nation's most popular podcasts, which has been enormously helpful to me personally in the last 2 weeks, trying to unpack what's going on around the world. Thank you, Steve, for that great podcast. His reporting has taken him across the United States, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, Pakistan, and China. His search for the full story behind the news has led him to researching history, and he is the author of many history books, including Instant City, Jacksonland, and Imperfect Union. Now, about our two moderators. Ryan J. Woods is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. As an educator and an historian, he helps lead the development of award-winning experiences for exploring family history, heritage, and culture. He serves in leadership roles for a variety of nonprofit historical, genealogical, and educational organizations, including as a commissioner for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, our special guest co-moderator, Catherine Algor, is the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society and a noted historian, nonprofit leader, and public history innovator. She serves on boards and committees for such organizations as the National Women's History Museum, the Organization of American Historians, the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, and the Gilder Lehrman Institute. We'll be hearing soon from both Ryan Woods and Catherine Algor. But to start us off, Steve Inskeep, it is such an honor to have you here with your book. I really have enjoyed it, and I have learned so much from it. I know it's been such a busy 2 weeks for you, and it's probably a great challenge lunging between past and present and great differences of opinion. I thank you for taking time out and for taking us all back in time. So, Steve, over to you, and a great welcome from all of us.
Margaret, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. It has been a dramatic couple of weeks, but it's appropriate to be talking about history because the biggest of the many stories we've been covering the last couple of weeks in the Middle East is an argument about history and whose version of history is more correct and whose version of history prevails. And there are lives in the balance there. So it makes sense to be thinking seriously about history and to be engaged with it, although we have a somewhat different story to tell tonight. You also mentioned my work. I mean, I guess I should say, since it's the evening, people will often ask, what time do you go to work in the morning, since it is a morning show? So I'll just tell people, I get up at 3 when the show is on. I then get to work by 4, and the show goes on right at 5 a.m. sharp, without exception. And I was on the show this morning. So when I was preparing for this, I actually felt like I looked a little haggard. So I went up and shaved just for you guys. I shaved a second time today since it's been a little bit of a long day. But I'm really excited to be talking about this topic, which I have spent several years on exploring a character that I've been interested in all my life, as so many people are. And it's been really rewarding, and it's really rewarding to be here. I don't think that I would have had any ability to write anything particularly original about Abraham Lincoln had I not previously written 2 books about the 19th century, Jacksonland and Imperfect Union. Both traced different eras in the development of the United States. One pitted President Andrew Jackson, against John Ross, a Cherokee chief, as white settlers pushed Cherokees and other native nations west of the Mississippi. Imperfect Union was about the exploration and the American conquest of the West, and played on 2 very famous figures, John Charles Fremont and his wife Jessie Benton Fremont. And of course, John Fremont was the first Republican candidate for president in 1856. Abraham Lincoln appeared as a minor character in each of those books. In 1856, he was a politician who was important enough to be invited out of his home state of Illinois into other states to campaign for John C. Fremont. And this kept drawing me back to a character that I'd been interested in ever since I grew up in Indiana, where Lincoln spent most of his youth. As people in Indiana never tire of telling you, you get a lot of Lincoln information, maybe a little Lincoln propaganda about this young man who grew up with virtually no education, all but taught himself to read out in the woods, whose mother died when he was very young. It's a quite dramatic story. In fact, I'm glad that we've gone to some images here. Let's have a look at Lincoln, just some of the images of Lincoln. It's one of the most famous faces in the world, a very appealing face. I got to tell you, when I was a kid, I would read accounts that would describe Lincoln as ugly, and I didn't quite see it. I found him interesting. This is part of the legend of Abraham Lincoln. You see him reading a book by a fire, and it seems to be an awfully nice fireplace. I'm not sure he had such a great fireplace to begin with, because his family had very, very modest means. But he was interested in books. He would walk for miles to get a book, and this is part of the Lincoln legend about a man who educated himself. But I would like to tell a different story that I learned in the course of my research, and that is just first an observation that the books that were available to this kid in southern Indiana were not very numerous or very impressive. But what was numerous was people on neighboring farms and in nearby towns. Lincoln took an interest in people. And even if the books were sometimes not very good, the people always were of interest to a future Democratic leader, because so many of them would have the power of the vote. And Lincoln studied people. His stepmother told a story many years later of how young Abraham Lincoln, when people came into that cabin, he would sit quietly listening to the adults talk to his parents, just quietly listening. And then when the visitors had gone, he would ask questions about everything, down to the smallest detail, according to his stepmother. He wanted not just to have heard everything, but to understand everything. And he continued studying people through his life until a friend who served with him when he was a young state legislator said his mind was a great storehouse of facts about the motives of people. And let's hang on to that word motives, because it becomes important to the story. I want to show a few more Lincoln photos just because they're so awesome. If we can just move forward. This is Abraham Lincoln in the 1850s, which, as people being history buffs in this group will know, will be the period in which he was becoming a mature politician and turning full-time against slavery. And look at the hair. The hair is wild. There are stories about this particular photograph and how he didn't like the way his hair had been combed and just mussed it up at the end, which is taken as a sign of his understanding of political imagery, how important his image was. Let's look at another one here. This is Lincoln with a much more famous bit of imagery. It's the first known photograph of Lincoln while growing a beard, which is part of my story because of the person who was around to help him grow that beard. You can see it hasn't quite come in on the sides. Let's look again here for a moment at the next image. And here is possibly my favorite image of Abraham Lincoln. In 1863, he's president of the United States. He's got a nice suit. It's kind of shiny, and he just looks kind of majestic, but also skeptical. It looks like he's peering skeptically at something. You also can see in this photograph His eyes seem to be a slightly different size. One of the features that might have made people say that he came across as ugly, but that in spite of his looks, people would say that he had tremendous energy, that he could dominate a room. It was remarkable. Can I just completely derail this speech for just a moment? If you could bring the camera back to me, I don't even know if you're going to see this or not, but I'm going to do my best. I love that photo so much, and my daughters know how much I love that photo. So when my daughters were asking, what do you want for Christmas? I said, I want each of you to draw me something. And one of them drew Abraham Lincoln, which is now on my phone. And it's based on that photo that you saw. Okay, we can go on to the remainder of the Lincoln photos to just take a look here at our main character, our protagonist in these meetings. Here is the mature president in 1864. And this, if I'm not mistaken, is the photo that is on the $5 bill. But my favorite thing about this photo, and it's true of a lot of the photos in this book and other kinds of images, is the imperfections. You see the edges of the plate of that daguerreotype have worn away in different ways, and there's kind of a scratch that goes down there, kind of a white scratch to the right, our right, of Lincoln's face. Those are the things that get cleared away if you're making a special image of Lincoln or putting this image in a book usually, or putting him on the $5 bill. I asked the publisher to leave in those imperfections. And although some of the images in the book are zoomed in a little bit, so you lose some of those imperfections, you also still see many of them. And that was deliberate, because I'm talking about a man who had to deal with human nature, who had to deal with imperfect people and try to get them to do something better than what they had been doing, and who was himself imperfect. And so it seems to me appropriate and human that the flaws be left in the photographs. Let's look at one more. Oh, we've gone on beyond the photos, so we can back up for just a second here. Forgive me. Let's leave Lincoln on the screen for a moment. That's my imperfection, of which I have many. So I was fascinated by Lincoln, and all I had to do then was come up with an approach to Lincoln that had not been done in 18,000 other tries, which is what the head of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library tells me is the number of books that have been written about Lincoln, 18,000. I've heard other counts going up to 64 billion or whatever, but they're a lot. And a lot of them, I'm sure, are children's books or very simple books or very unimpressive books, but some of them are astonishingly deep and well-researched histories. So what could I possibly add? And I guess that my answer begins with my day job, or my early morning job, the one that I was doing after I shaved the first time this morning. And that's covering the news today, covering our divided country and our discordant world. And the things that I see and the things that I learn when covering politics today drive me back into the past and fascinate me with figures who walked the same ground that I walk in Washington, D.C., and in many cases stood or sat or worked in the same buildings. The White House was there. The U.S. Capitol was there. There's a cottage not very far at all from my house here in Washington, D.C., called the Lincoln Cottage, which, as I bet many people know, is where Lincoln and his family would stay during the hot summers in Washington, D.C., because it's very slightly higher here, like 300 feet higher, and therefore a couple of degrees cooler than it was down by the Potomac. So these buildings still exist that Lincoln walked in, that other people walked in, and it draws me back into history. They also were working the same political system, the same basic separation of powers in the Republic between the three branches of government, and state and federal government, and all the other different separations of powers that we have. And human nature was about the same. And so when I research the past, it gives me insights into the present. And as I cover the past, I would like to think it gives me insights, or as I cover the present, it gives me insights into the past. Do it both ways is what I'm trying to do. There's another imperfection. I conceived of trying to tell Lincoln's whole life story through a series of meetings that he had, face-to-face meetings with different people. And my first thought was to capture the diversity of America. We know very well, and I certainly see every day on my job, how incredibly diverse America has become. It's plain to me from my research that America was a diverse country then, even though white men had all the power and virtually all the attention. There were all kinds of people around. And I wanted to see Lincoln in action with some of those people. And so I was thinking about differences. And I worked very hard as I assembled my list of 16 people who had face-to-face meetings with Abraham Lincoln to make sure that they were of different races, different genders, different backgrounds, different classes, different regions, and above all, different beliefs. The majority of them are white men because it's the 19th century, but I think that you will find that there's a good variety in there, and there are many different kinds of people. And because I covered the news, I came to realize that the story here, the thing that's most relevant, is not just the difference or the diversity, but the disagreement. And in most of these meetings, there is some profound difference between the characters, a totally different background, a totally different perspective, or wanting opposite or conflicting things. And Lincoln's job is to try to figure out what to do in that situation, how he could handle that situation. I want to just go very quickly through a few of these individuals if I can. And we'll just put them into categories. There are radicals, anti-slavery people, like the person in the next slide, Owen Lovejoy. Owen Lovejoy was an anti-slavery pastor in Illinois, a radical anti-slavery activist who made his house an active stop on the Underground Railroad, whose brother had been killed. Elijah Lovejoy had been killed for printing anti-slavery editorials in a newspaper. And this made Owen Lovejoy even more committed to the anti-slavery cause. Let's look at another radical if we can, Frederick Douglass. Douglass, of course, escaped from slavery and became a famous writer and orator. And I have come to learn how significant a political figure he was as well. He began, and you can bring the camera back to me for a moment if you would like. He began his he began his anti-slavery career disdaining politics. He had learned from William Lloyd Garrison of Boston and other abolitionists in Massachusetts and elsewhere in New England that the Constitution was completely tainted by slavery, and therefore it was morally wrong to respect it or even to vote. Abolitionists would burn copies of the Constitution, and Douglass was in that camp at the beginning, but he gradually began to realize that it was important to participate in politics. He moved to upstate New York, to Rochester, New York, where a black man could vote, not on equal terms with white men. They had to have property, but they could vote. And that was a bit of power, a sliver of power that Douglass could use against slavery, and he grabbed that power and he became active in politics. He became a supporter eventually of the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln because it was an anti-slavery party, even though Douglass didn't think it was anti-slavery enough. And when the Civil War came, he supported the war effort. He recruited Union soldiers after the Emancipation Proclamation, and then grew angry and dismayed because he had promised black soldiers equal treatment with white men, equal pay, equal promotions, equal benefits, and they got none of these things. So he went to Abraham Lincoln to protest. That is one of the meetings in this book. Owen Lovejoy, who we looked at there for a moment, is another one of the meetings in this book. A little bit earlier in Lincoln's career, he was opposed to slavery. He always considered slavery wrong, but also was skeptical of abolitionists, of radicals, because he didn't see the practical point. All they would do was split the anti-slavery vote with more mainstream parties. That was his feeling as a politician, which is what Lincoln fundamentally was. And in fact, there were examples in which this had happened. But Owen Lovejoy was one of the people who helped to found the Republican Party of Illinois, the branch in Illinois, and asked Abraham Lincoln to join. Lincoln found them so suspicious he left town. Apparently he had business in court in another location. He skipped, in any case, their opening convention. And yet Lovejoy and others thought that Lincoln was a great speaker, knew that he could appeal to people, and that he opposed slavery. They named him to the party's central committee, even though he had accepted no such invitation and hadn't even shown up for their meeting. And they ended up working together and working toward a big convention in 1856, where both men spoke against slavery, and each appeared to have influenced the other. That's another meeting. Let's bring the photos back to look at a couple of very different figures, because this is also a story of conservatives, extreme conservatives. There's a famous figure, George McClellan, one of the most frustrating generals, surely the most frustrating general that Lincoln faced. Lincoln promoted this young man from an elite background to the top post in the army, and McClellan treated him with disdain and contempt. They disagreed on how to fight the war, and even, it turns out, disagreed on slavery. McClellan was a Northerner, but had sympathies for the Southern point of view, and even gave Lincoln a memo in 1862 saying we should not interfere with the relations of servitude. And this was while Lincoln was on his way to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had to figure out a way to get some use out of this monumentally frustrating man who considered him an idiot. And that is one of the meetings in this book. Let's look at another conservative if we can. Duff Green is an incredible historical figure, a newspaperman and propagandist who supported Andrew Jackson for the presidency in the 1820s, had involvement with other presidents over the years, and was a friend of Abraham Lincoln. He also was a slave owner and became an extreme pro-slavery ideologue in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. But finally, in 1860, when Lincoln had won the presidential election, and Southern states that supported slavery and considered him a threat began to declare that they were seceding from the Union, Duff Green went to the president-elect in Springfield, Illinois, and tried to persuade him to compromise over slavery. That was one of the meetings in this book. Let's look at a couple of other different kinds of characters here. We have characters that I would label outcasts. William Flourville, Lincoln's barber, was a Haitian immigrant, a black man who had this intimate connection with Lincoln and yet lived in a totally different legal world because he lived under the Illinois black laws, which placed all sorts of legal limitations on black people in Illinois. And yet Flourville is the man who, as best I can determine, in a meeting in his barber shop in November of 1860, sculpted Lincoln's beard. It was a Shenandoah beard. Somebody had to shave around the lips and mouth, and that would have been Flourville, Lincoln's barber. Another of the outcasts is seen here, and this is Lean Bear, a Cheyenne chief who came to Washington to meet the president in 1863 as part of a Plains Indians delegation. They'd been invited there in hopes of avoiding a war with white settlers. And Lean Bear had a warning in his meeting with Abraham Lincoln. He said, "We are peaceful. The people you have to watch out for are the white settlers." That was one of the meetings, and the result of that is one of the most tragic events in this story. Let's look at another group of people, and then I'll talk about this story a little bit more. There are a number of women in this book, and one of them is Jessie Benton Fremont, who I got to write about previously in Imperfect Union and got to revisit her story here. Super famous, wealthy background, creative, interested in politics, and by many people's accounts, the brains behind her husband, John Charles Fremont. Her husband, of course, was the one, because it was the 19th century, her husband was the one who got the fame and got the position and became a Civil War general and did something that Lincoln did not agree with in 1861 relating to slavery. And so John Charles Fremont, rather than just obey Lincoln's order to modify what he was doing, sent Jessie back to Washington to argue with him. It was an argument over slavery. She went to the White House. That's one of the meetings in this book. Let's look at a couple more, and then we'll have a little discussion, or one more anyway. I love this picture. Do you not love this picture? I can't see you nodding, but I hope people are nodding. It's like a triptych. It's like a work of art. Mary Todd Lincoln, around the time she became First Lady, at which time her taste in expensive dresses was approved by the newspapers and made her seem glamorous rather than someone who was overspending and ultimately getting her husband into a monumental amount of debt. So these are some of the main characters in the book, and you can bring the camera back to me and I'll just discuss them for a couple of minutes and then invite a discussion here, which I'm really looking forward to. I tried to, through these 16 meetings, get a sense of how Lincoln did his job. Just as you can best see an athlete in motion on the field, I thought you could best see Lincoln in action with other people. And I tried to get a sense of some of the characteristics that made him so effective, not always successful with people with whom he disagreed. I wrote down a number of lists here. First, he was about politics. He was a politician. He was unashamed about that. He didn't consider it a bad word. He understood that a politician's job was to build a majority in favor of something that was good, and therefore he needed to deal with all kinds of people, even people who were wrong, because people who were wrong still had the vote. He had empathy for other people. He thought about them a lot, as I said. He used a lot of patience. He would put up with insults from someone like General McClellan, who in one famous incident ignored the president. The president came to his house and waited for an hour or more for McClellan to come home. And when McClellan arrived, he walked right past the sitting room where Lincoln was and went up to bed without a word. Lincoln said nothing about this insult. He waited for his moment to get what he needed out of McClellan. He was patient. And above all, he had a particular view of human nature. And his view was that people were motivated primarily by self-interest, which sounds grim or even cynical, but someone has to look after your interests, and it's going to be you. And Lincoln understood that, and he would try to engage people's self-interest in a higher cause. This is how he argued that white voters should oppose slavery. Remember, in Illinois, it's an entirely white electorate. Because of the black laws, black men, other people can't vote. Women can't vote, of course. There are a few states where black men can vote, but the overwhelming majority of the electorate is white. And Lincoln would tell them that slavery was bad for them, that it competed with free labor, that it was going to expand into their states if they didn't stop it, that it made the United States' pretensions as a beacon of liberty just an embarrassment before the world. He told white voters why slavery was against their interests. And when the war came and Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln told voters that the Emancipation Proclamation was in their interest, even if they were racist, even if they didn't agree with the proclamation, because black men freed from slavery were fighting for the Union. It's a really remarkable story. I know we're about to talk about how I came about it, how I reached these 16 characters, how I assembled them the way that I did. And I'll just kick that off by noting that I had no particular system. It was a matter of improvisation, of looking around, writing a while, looking some more, realizing when I got stuck in the writing that I hadn't done enough research. And we can talk more about that. It was an improvised course, but I feel that is appropriate for the subject. Lincoln was feeling his way toward a more free and more equal America. He did not have in his platform at the inauguration in 1861 any of the great acts that he eventually was known for. The Emancipation Proclamation did not fully end slavery and left a lot of work to do. In the very last speech of his life, Lincoln was talking about whether and how black men should receive the vote. It was a process. And that's how Lincoln saw democracy. And that's how Lincoln saw the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. In one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, he said that that promise had been put in the Declaration for future use, and that equality could never be perfectly attained, but could be constantly approximated in ways that added to the happiness of all people of all colors everywhere. And I think that that is a good note to move on to the next part of our discussion, because that is the way that democracy is. It's never over. No issue is ever over. It's a process. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Ryan and Catherine. Thanks, guys.
Hello, Steve. It is a pleasure indeed to have the opportunity to engage in conversation with you, along with Catherine Allgore, one of the foremost leaders in the historical institution world. We plan to cover a range of topics and themes here and address questions that our audience has, and also your process for writing history. At this juncture, I will turn it over to Catherine to kick off our conversation.
Thank you so much. I so enjoyed this book, and you did a great job sort of figuring out how you could write a book about Lincoln that just hadn't been written.
Thank
But
you.
I wonder if it's one of those things where, so you have this idea of conversations, and you have this idea of like, well, what happens if the person in the conversation disagrees with Lincoln? What are we going to learn? So I have a sort of a two-part question. One is, did you ever find yourself cursing that you had trapped yourself with this very clever idea? And it was also very striking to me the different kinds of learning that Lincoln did in these conversations, including times where there have been people that seemed a little bit ahead of their time.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you. Did I curse that I felt stuck with the idea? I don't know that I exactly did that. I was happy with the idea. I would sometimes curse or almost curse when I didn't have enough information to reconstruct a meeting. That happened. There are people that I wish I could have gotten into the book and there wasn't enough of a historical record. I was happy to have the diversity that I did, for example, but I would have been happier if there were even more women and there were more people of color. But it's kind of a bitter reality of the time that the records were not as extensive for some kinds of people. And I wanted to go by reliable records, meetings that were reasonably well documented, where at least one of the participants had left a record, and ideally something had been said by both about the participants, and where there was a lot of context so you could figure out what was going on. And that was hard. And that did influence the characters that I could choose or that I had to leave out. The other question was, I mean, I'm just kind of gobsmacked by the part where it was terribly clever, and so I've kind of lost track of the other part of your question. I appreciate that.
No,
But your other part of the question was what?
asking that, but there are moments where, and I think you sort of even say this, Jesse Fremont comes
Oh
in.
yeah.
And
Yeah, people ahead of their time. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, let's go back. I mentioned that when we were showing the picture. That was a dispute about slavery. John Charles Fremont in 1861 issued an Emancipation Proclamation for Missouri, saying that he would free the slaves of Missouri rebels. And Lincoln wasn't ready to do that, was trying to keep as many slaveholders as possible loyal to the Union, which was part of his coalition building and prioritizing making hard choices about what was more important. So he wasn't ready to do emancipation. And aside from that, he didn't feel it was John Charles Fremont's job. It was a political decision, which he said belonged to civilian authority, belonged to him. And so, yeah, he ended up restraining the Fremonts, even though they were doing approximately, not exactly, the circumstances were different, in principle, the same thing that Lincoln himself would be doing about a year later.
Yeah, yeah. So interesting. Ryan, let's get you in on this, my friend.
Steve, you've said a lot about Lincoln as a politician. That is not exactly a word that sparks joy in the minds of many people today.
No.
However, most Americans believe Abraham Lincoln is the best and most influential president in U.S. history. And unprompted, he is listed as the historical figure that most Americans admire. After spending all this time with him, does his reputation hold up, and why?
Yeah, although I think he's a little different than the Lincoln as I understood him to be. I don't think before this research that I understood how he rose, and what methods he used, and exactly what he thought about human nature and about people. There are a lot of things that were kind of hazy to me. And Lincoln is strangely a hazy figure, even though he's so super famous and there are all these books. It's kind of hard to get your hands around him. And he's also a little bit of a mysterious figure. He was very careful in how he talked. He used a lot of silences when he could have said a little bit more. And of course, he didn't live to write a memoir. So things were hazy, and I felt that I gradually got a sense of what it was that he did and the mechanics of it. And I have a friend, Noelle King, who has a great Vox podcast called Today Explained. And she's one of several people who are in the acknowledgments because they read chapters of this book as it was developing. And after reading them, she said, I would previously have said Lincoln succeeded because he was good. I now feel that Lincoln succeeded because he was smart. And that encapsulates, in very few words, something that I would have taken a lot more words to say. you just got a sense of his cleverness with people and also the ruthless decisions that he sometimes had to make to succeed.
Yeah, I was going to say too, as a historian of the early republic, I've been on my own historical hobby horse to rescue this idea that politics is not a dirty word.
Yeah.
Like John Locke said, men are social animals. He meant men, but we say people now. And of course, politics is just the institutionalization. So when I read what Ryan's talking about, which is the very first page where you're trying to redeem Lincoln as a politician, in addition to a visionary and practically a saint, I thought, oh, controversy right from the start. But I would not be a good representative of our mutual, Ryan and Mi's mutual jobs without asking you about the role of archivists and libraries in your research.
Sure.
You have a great deal, your bibliography is huge, and the list of papers and archives. Can you talk a little bit about that? And was there a fabulous story where an archivist found something you had no idea either existed?
Yeah. I mean, it was a very weird book to research because I began in early 2020 and all the archives were closed. I have done the primary research for all of my books in the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C. I've spent countless afternoons or Saturdays or whatever, like in the reading rooms, in the manuscript reading room, or in the, when I could get away with it, in the giant main reading room at the Library of Congress, which is gorgeous, and spent a lot of time there. And of course, that would have been the case again with this because they have a fantastic Lincoln collection. But for a large part of my research period, they were closed. I was fortunate that there is such obsessive interest with Lincoln because I'm able to go online at the Library of Congress and look at all of their documents, and there are searchable databases of all of Lincoln's words. And I have on my shelf over here used copy of Lincoln's collected works that I bought somewhere. And I mean, you just do what you can. Eventually, Michelle Crowell, an excellent and deeply experienced archivist at the Library of Congress, who I think had worked in the past with Doris Kearns Goodwin and other people, let me in to the back room to see a bunch of the original documents, which are truly amazing. And you must know this from your own work. Like, you can read the transcript of the letter or whatever, but there's something special about holding it and thinking someone wrote that in 1814. I particularly think of a first draft of Lincoln's first inaugural. Lincoln wrote it out longhand, and then he gave it to a printer in Springfield to have copies run off on a printing press so that he could correct it and show it to other people. And there's a copy of the first inaugural that somebody stored in a carpet bag for decades, and it got all wet. And that changed the color of the paper so it almost looks like a abstract artwork. But they've got this thing, and it just blew my mind. I just loved it. There are documents and sources elsewhere that I was able to use. Historical societies in random places. One of my chapters culminates in the Lincoln-Douglas debate in Alton, Illinois, and the County Historical Society there had information that was useful to me and documents that were useful to me. Joshua Speed is Lincoln's best friend and the guy who effectively gave the title to this book, because Lincoln disagreed with him about slavery and wrote a letter in which he said, "Differ we must." The Speed family house, Farmington is what it's called, outside of Louisville, is now a historic site. And they had letters that I couldn't find anywhere else, where the family was talking about Lincoln's visit there in 1841. And so I reached out to them. It's still the pandemic. We're not traveling much, but they made images, scans of these letters and sent them to me. The Lincoln Presidential Library had documents that I couldn't find anywhere else, like the very first ballot that Lincoln ever cast. There were public voting ballots in those years in Illinois, so you can see who he voted for and who everybody else voted for, and they sent them. And when I was able to travel, I traveled, of course, to Springfield. And the old state capitol in Springfield was closed for construction, for renovation. But the guy who runs it for the state of Illinois gave me hard hats, gave my family hard hats. I brought several of my family along, and we wandered around by ourselves in the state legislative chamber where Lincoln had given the House divided speech, which was amazing. I'll mention one more source, and it's not exactly archival, but it's just walking around Washington, D.C. And thinking about the events that took place here. And I mean, there's a scene where I try to reconstruct Lincoln going from the old soldiers' home that I mentioned all the way down to the White House is kind of his daily commute in the summer. And I have made that commute, that approximate commute. And of course, it's filled with buildings that did not exist then, but you can like look at old maps and look at the landscape and think about what it would be like to ride a horse down this slope that I've ridden a bike down many times, and then combine that with archival accounts. It turns out that Walt Whitman was keeping a diary and wrote this beautiful description of watching Lincoln pass by a few days away from a couple of days before the actual meeting in question. So it was a matter of combining all of those sources in a way that I'm sure is very familiar to you, and doing it in a very strange, improvised, and a non-library way, because the libraries were closed, but they were still helping me and getting me things from all over the place.
Weaving together both where the material came from and Lincoln's story specifically, were you able to glean any sense of his development over time? In early chapters, there are many people on this call, for example, on this meeting, who are interested in family history and had this pervasive view that his mother was born out of wedlock, as you write about. And did you get a sense that there was a progression of his development as a public figure as you looked at these sources?
Yeah, he definitely matured over time and learned from experience. I'm wanting to mention an aside. I mean, there's a family Bible that at one point Lincoln goes and fills out the genealogy such as he knows it, and it's after his father's death. And I realized his father had the Bible and could not probably have written enough or well enough to fill it out, and so Lincoln took the opportunity to do it. But you talked about personal growth. I ended up feeling a little differently about that than maybe some other people do. The ordinary thing, the commonplace insight about Lincoln is that he grew tremendously, that he was this rural guy without a lot of education, and that he grew immensely, and including through his presidency, because he had no executive experience when he began. And of course, that's true. But I just thought about it a little differently. I thought what he did was respond creatively to circumstances. It wasn't exactly that he grew, but that he faced extraordinary challenges and grew in ways to meet them. It's a little different in my mind. And I realized that it's not that his view of slavery particularly changed. His position on slavery in a statement that he made in 1837, which is the first public statement he made about slavery, is about the same as his position on slavery in 1861, that the Constitution protects it. I can't do anything about it in the states where it exists, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with banning it on federal property, and it's just wrong. It's based on injustice and bad policy. He had that in an early age, and so it's not that he grew into that in some way or had some kind of moral growth. I think that he had a lot of practice, I guess is what I'm saying. He got a lot of practice through these meetings, and that is what led to his maturation and his success. Lincoln himself had this idea that people were primarily shaped by circumstances, and that you shouldn't think that you're a superior human being just because your circumstances are better than somebody else. And I think that's kind of true of him. The key to him is the way that he responded to those circumstances.
So as Ryan said, we have in our audience a lot of other budding writers, aspiring writers, or actually quite accomplished ones. So they're starting to come out with questions. You're going to give some free advice here, Steve.
Great.
And part of it, we're all interested in the writing process, but in particular, it seems to me, and this is a complete, generalization, the work of the journalist is fast, and the writing is completely dictated by time. Apparently, according to you, it starts very early in the morning. None of these things seem to be the opposite of what most writers want to do. So what was it? How did it feel to not be a journalist and become a biographer? Or is that wrong? Was there a feeling of continuity for you?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that. We have these constant deadlines and often things happening live that you're talking about live. And when that's happening, you're effectively writing as fast as you talk, like you're not
Right.
even writing, but you're trying to give news in an intelligible way. And even though that is the case, I am constantly fighting for extra time, trying to hold the story for an extra day if I can, to think about it some more and reflect on it. Or even if I only have 1 extra minute to reflect on that story, 1 extra minute, or go through it one more time before we put it on the air. And I guess the same thing is true of my books, except on a grand scale. I begin them improvisationally, as I suggested before. I'm not a trained archivist. I guess I'm self-educated in that way, if I'm educated at all. And I get excited about a story, and I get excited about some research that I do, and I start writing. And then I get stuck. And when I'm stuck, I realize that's because I don't know enough yet. But the writing that I've started informs where I need to go, and I go searching, and I go back and forth, and I write some more, and then I research some more, and I write some more. Often this is highly imperfect. Sometimes a year into a particular story or chapter, I discover the fact that I wish I'd known a year ago, and often though it leads me someplace organic and original, perhaps, and not the place that I would have gotten with a more systematic approach. I do enjoy the luxury of time. I will say that I'm still like kind of desperate for time, because I have this job and I have 3 kids and I have a wife, and it takes a lot of time, and they deserve my time. They probably deserve more of my time than they get. And so sometimes I am desperately in a hurry, but I just try to go back and reflect on what I've written again and again and again and again. I did edit this book obsessively, and I think my amazing publisher, Ann Godoff, who's also my editor, edited it obsessively with very high standards. There were a couple of times when she asked me for changes, and I did what I thought were exactly the changes that were needed. And she's like, no, that's not right. And so I kind of came back and did it again. And at some point, I was like on the 14th draft and nowhere near the end. But that, I guess, is a luxury. That I would concede is something that you couldn't often do in journalism, is set it aside and wait a month and come back and write it 20 more times, which I surely did.
Continuing on the notion of the process of writing history. So you have these 16 encounters here. At what point did you begin to develop the story arc for this book?
Well, I mean, in a way that was very, very early. In fact, in a phone call with my publisher, I suggested to her that I thought that I could tell Lincoln's whole life story through maybe a dozen or more encounters, face-to-face encounters. So the concept was his whole life chronologically through a series of discrete face-to-face meetings. Now, the arc changed a lot. The first meeting that I told her about was a wrestling match that Lincoln had as a young man with a bully named Jack Armstrong when he was 23 years old. And it's a heck of a yarn that is hard to document, but so much fun. And I actually wrote that chapter, but ultimately threw it out. I believe it's referred to briefly. There's a kind of introductory chapter that deals with that in a paragraph or two. That was a whole chapter once upon a time. There was an early chapter about Mary Todd Lincoln and the courtship between Lincoln and Mary Todd. And I ended up throwing that out. There was a chapter about a duel that Lincoln almost fought. It would have been a great chapter if he'd fought the duel, but it didn't quite fit the story that I wanted to tell ultimately, and I tossed that out even though I wrote it. I ended up starting a little bit later. The first chapter is of Joshua Giddings, radical anti-slavery figure who was in Congress at the same time Lincoln was in the 1840s. Mary Todd, who got cut from the early sections of the book, reappears at the end. That has been one of the most debated things about this book so far. People's initial reaction sometimes is, why are you putting the wife at the end? But I think of her as the finale. And I also find that story, I mean, you'll tell me if I told it, related it well, but it's very personal It's very intimate, and she is present after he is gone. And so she is there for the aftermath. And I felt that it was appropriate to put her at the end. So the concept never changed, but the parts moved around a lot. And I was, in this improvisational way that I said, continuously discovering new characters. I think the last one that I discovered is one we haven't mentioned yet, Mary Ellen Wise, a woman who's very, very hard to document. I mean, almost no fact of her life can be reliably documented, except that it appears that she was a young woman who cut off her hair, put on men's clothes, and joined the Union Army pretending to be a man, as many people did. A number of women did in the Civil War, and she showed up in 1864 at the White House claiming to be owed back pay and asked for Lincoln's help in being paid. Even though her story was, very hard to document, Lincoln signed a letter to the federal paymaster saying, pay this woman. And if anything is proven to be wrong about it, I'll cover the difference myself. It's an amazing story to me. So the parts didn't come together fully until late, but the concept I held to throughout.
Yeah, and actually, Julie, in our audience, Julie, I hope that answered your question. You were answering it without knowing it. Very Lincoln-esque of you, Steve. But yeah, she was wondering the sort of relationship between research and story. We also have in our audience a former reporter, recovering reporter, Teresa, having difficulty writing a family story without making it sound like a news story. How did you, or do you, merge the two different ways of writing? Do you have any thoughts for Teresa?
Well, that's very interesting. It's hard for me to say without knowing the story, but keeping things in the order in which they happened is not the worst advice to give in this circumstance. And that can make your story start slow. You have to start it at the right point. But keeping things in order, it's the way a children's book is. It's the way Harry Potter books are. Once there was this baby and he was left somehow on a step by these mysterious people, and we're going to find out everything gradually all the way along about what the heck is going on here. But one thing happens and then another thing happens. And this is what a child would ask you if you were telling a story. What happened next? What happened next? And it creates a kind of natural suspense. There is a tendency to write in different forms, to say, I'm going to do an analytical look at what's going on, or I'm going to look at a particular theme. And you can do that, and it can be brilliant, but it's a lot harder. It puts you to a higher standard to hold people's attention without that natural storytelling. So somehow telling things in order, I think, creates a narrative and creates suspense. And then the next choice is when to begin. I have mixed feelings about my own books and how I did on that. In the Imperfect Union book, I cover the Fremonts, not for their whole lives, because other people had done that. Not very many, but other people had done that. And some parts of their lives were less interesting than others. But I covered from about 1842 to 1856, about a 14-year period. And afterward, I thought I could have compressed that. I could have done fewer years. I could have done less and maybe done them better, more powerfully, more strongly, and maybe even a shorter book. And I mean, that's another thing to think about. You can write a 1,000-page book, and people have, and some of my favorite books in the world are 1,000-page books. But most people, like, the longer it gets, the smaller the audience is for people who are going to get through this. And I would think, even if it's like a family history, I mean, I don't know what your intended audience is, if it's like just your family, or if you're thinking that this is something for a general audience, but a tightly focused story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end has a lot to say for it.
Steve, I'd like to return to a content question. Real or perceived, there is a notion that historical literacy is on the decline. And yet there is also a high level of consciousness about how we think about and treat influential figures of the past. Could you speak to how you think this book addresses Lincoln as a person in a time and place?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about historical literacy, and I'm trying to recall some of those, headlines from The Onion, where, the guy insists that all these things are in the Constitution that obviously aren't in the Constitution. So yeah, I get the historical illiteracy. And Lincoln is a ripe field for it because there's so many stories about Lincoln that you can't particularly verify. And also Lincoln is a timeless figure that we use all the time. It's easy to pull out a Lincoln quote. I mean, it's like pulling out a Hitler quote, it's like, or whatever, like that's the dark version. Lincoln is the bright version of that. Hitler is a really dark version of that. And there are a couple of other figures that you can just pull out a quote, and maybe it's true and maybe it's relevant, but Lincoln said this to General Grant or whatever. And you feel like you're winning your argument. But you asked about putting him back in his particular time and place. I wanted to do that, even though I felt that I was also speaking to now and speaking to our divided times now. I wanted to have a sense of space, of what the landscape was like, of what communication was like, of how long it took to get from one place to another, of the increase in the speed of information during the time that Lincoln was alive, what the buildings were like, and what the people were like and what the issues were like. I tried to relate that in real time with some sense, or the best that I could reconstruct, of what it might have been to be there then. And I mean, that took a lot of work. It took a lot of work, especially since, as I said, I'm walking around the landscape today, and I don't want to assume that the landscape then was exactly the same. But I think it's really important. It's worth the work. And that, I mean, that's another thing about putting the narrative in order, in chronological order, which ultimately I did. I mean, all of these, as I planned all along, I mean, it's a beginning to an end of his life. You can encounter events in the order that our main character encountered them. You can see, or at least try to see, how Lincoln may have viewed things without the benefit of hindsight that we have. Of course, we can't forget that, like, we know who won the Civil War and everything, but when you see things in order, you have a better chance to understand his time, his place, and how he viewed these sometimes excruciating decisions he had to make.
So I want to push a little bit and if you don't want to keep talking about today, we don't have to do that. I should tell you, I was reading your book in preparation for this. I was at the Willard Hotel, and there's that feeling.
Awesome.
Now, I did find out there's 2 Willard hotels in DC, but in my mind, I was in the correct one.
Okay.
And I'm going to tell you which one it is, because in my mind, it absolutely is.
Gotcha.
We have a very saucy audience member named Newt, who says Lincoln's most famous phrase, second inaugural, with malice towards none. Anyone with this mindset today, Newt, that's very saucy of you, and I won't ask that.
Oh!
But I will say, can you tell us, because no one can write history probably any time, but these days, without answering the question, what is relevant today for our audience, for the American reading public? What is relevant today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking at the way Lincoln handled disagreement offers lessons for us. And it's not that the situations or people are exactly the same. But he went into these conversations with people who he believed to have morally wrong positions. People who were in favor of slavery, that's appalling. People who hated immigrants, which Lincoln found to be appalling. And he would just deal with them as human beings. He wouldn't consider it personal. He even told an anti-slavery audience that they were no better as human beings than slaveholders, because it was all about your circumstances. He said, if we were in their position, in their circumstances, we would probably do just as they do and defend this terrible system out of self-interest. The problem is the system. And that, I think, is a lesson for today, not to make these things personal, which, I mean, everybody does on social media and everywhere else. It's hard to avoid that being directed at you, people making personal comments. But if you can avoid making it personal and make it about the issue, that's useful. The second thing, I think, is to consider what is possible when you're dealing with someone who's politically different. If your uncle that you see at Thanksgiving has what you consider to be crazy political ideas and is imbibing all kinds of political nonsense and has for years, you probably are not going to convert that person to your point of view over Thanksgiving dinner. That's just not practical. People don't necessarily change their points of view so quickly. But Lincoln wasn't really trying to do that necessarily. He was not asking people to change their fundamental beliefs. He was listening to them and trying to figure out if out of 10 things, there was one thing they could work together on. You don't agree with me about slavery, but I bet you agree with me about the United States. Let's fight for the Union. You don't agree with me about slavery, but I bet you're happy that black men are fighting instead of white men in some places. So let's go for that. And he would try to frame things so that he could bring along at least some support. And I think that that is relevant, not only in our political lives, but in our personal lives. I have a friend who read some chapters of this book and said she couldn't get the phrase "differ we must" out of her mind while she was having a family argument about disposing of a piece of property. I have a friend who said she thought of this book when a relative was getting married into a politically different family, and how do I deal with these wildly different people? So, I mean, I think there are all kinds of circumstances which apply.
Mm.
As I was reading the book, the notion of perfect is the enemy of the good kept coming to mind. You make the point that Lincoln is a politician and he's a tactician as well. You also make the point that, in fact, he's not an abolitionist, but he looks for pragmatic solutions. And could you speak to the notion of, it might seem sort of cognitive dissonance today to say Abraham Lincoln's not an abolitionist.
Yeah. I mean, we see slavery as this black and white thing, and it was. It's just wrong. And we should try to be clear on the historical record here. Lincoln always believed slavery was wrong, was never a moderate like some slavery is okay. But he believed that the Constitution gave him very little that he could say about it in southern states where he did not live. And so he argued to restrict slavery. And when we say he was not an abolitionist, that means he was not calling for the radical overturning of the laws that protected slavery, the unbelievable legal framework of slavery. He was in favor of doing what he could get away with politically and legally against slavery, but he always considered it wrong. And it's kind of wild and I think instructive to think about the incredible variety of opinions about slavery. There was a small group of people who understood how wrong it was and considered the United States so tainted by it they burned copies of the Constitution and so forth. There was a fairly large group of people who practiced slavery, the white people, I guess we should clarify, practiced slavery and believed in it and believed in the ideology of it and everything else. And then there was a very large group of people who would have this very strange approach of saying slavery is an evil, slavery is unfortunate, slavery is morally wrong, slavery should end sometime. And then they would have this incredible series of rationalizations for why now was not the time, or why this or that wouldn't work, or why free black people, if they were too numerous, would not be able to live in society. They'd destabilize society. There'd be a race war. I could go on and on and on and on. Need to be sent somewhere else. There were incredible rationalizations about slavery. And so the challenge was like, who had an actual practical plan? And that's the thing that I realized about Lincoln that I think is true today. Like he didn't have some revelation that he suddenly realized slavery was wrong. I mean, even some slave owners realized that slavery was wrong, but they continued practicing it. The question was, who can do something practically about it? And I think that's super true of big political systemic problems that we face today. And I mean, I won't get political here and name a bunch of issues, but there are a lot of big systemic issues where, I mean, it's easy for us to know that pollution is wrong. And then the question is, what can we do about it? It might be easy for us to like shrink our carbon footprint, but we sort of know that that's not going to actually do the job either. And so we have to think in terms of what would actually make a difference, what would change systems to make the world a better place or make it more fair. I think there's just a lot in this way that Lincoln approached issues and people.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was a professor, it was always easy for my students, who were, of course, young people, to be very judgmental about, well, obviously slavery was wrong. Why couldn't they see it? And this was before, it's a little while ago, Steve. So it was a little bit before we had climate change. And one of the things I would say is what is going on in our lives now that in 100 years, they're going to go, those people were nuts.
Yeah.
You know, and I used to use the sort of that example of vegetarianism and eating animals, because we eat animals, but we also keep them in our houses as pets, and we wear them. And it was a really good teaching moment. Just trying to get into this conversation in 19th century America about what is slavery? Is it good or bad? And more than anything else, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, those are great examples, and it's a great question, a humbling question to ask. What are we doing now that 100 years from now, people will be baffled that we thought it was okay?
Yeah.
And it may well be, as with slavery, that a lot of people knew it was not okay, but didn't do enough about it.
Steve, as you were going through, and obviously Lincoln is a known quantity, are there characters in the book that have sparked your interest, surprised you, you want to learn more about?
Yes, but I'm going to do a dramatic thing here. I have very low battery now, so I'm going to turn off the camera for just a second. This is very funny. And I'm going to unplug this light and plug in the cord so that you don't lose me. And now I'm back in a slightly darker environment, but with power. So this is great.
You have drama. You have dramatic.
Yeah,
it's very dramatic. It's
Thank
great.
you. Thank you. I mean, there are a lot of people that I mean, I think about somebody like Mary Ellen Wise. I mean, it would be amazing to learn more about this mysterious person or people like her. Frederick Douglass is an endlessly fascinating figure. I could just as well have written a biography of him, I suppose, although there is an amazing one from a couple of years back, Blight, that is an incredible book. It would be hard to add too much to that. But I think about people at the margins, about outcasts. I mean, I had such a person in Jacksonland, because John Ross was a Cherokee chief who was he was an elite in his way, but he was also being shoved out of the margins of society. It was fascinating to focus on Jesse Benton Fremont in the second book. In this case, I have someone who began at the margins in a very modest way and rose up. But I think I've become more interested in people who are like pushing for power, who are seeking power. So I'm not certain that I have an exact answer. Like, you know, I ran across this character and I want to write a whole book about him. But I am thinking about what I want to explore next, whether it's the 19th century or some other century. But I want to understand the lives of ordinary people.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Well, amazingly, we have reached the end of our Q&A session, and I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Margaret Talcott, for the very next part of our program.
Hopefully.
All of you, thank you so much. It was so interesting. I learned a tremendous amount, as did everyone out there. And as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Author Series, we have asked Steve to share a reading from the book, Let There Be Light. Steve, back to you for that.
Sure. I'm gonna give a paragraph here that gets into the research of this book, because I know that's what interests a lot of people, and it just suggests a little bit of what's out there, the unbelievable wealth of Lincoln literature that I gained and learned from. The notes and bibliography itemize my debts to generations of scholars and Lincoln obsessives whose work across centuries made mine possible. My shelves have filled with Lincoln books. A little bit of a visual aid there. Memoirs, diaries, studies of places Lincoln lived, oral histories, psychological analyses, and books by people who gathered so much information that the covers barely contain it. William Herndon interviewed or corresponded with hundreds of people who knew Lincoln. The resulting notes and letters fill an 864-page book, edited by Douglas L. Wilson and Rodney O. Davis. Lincoln Day by Day, by Earl S. Myers and C. Percy Powell, is a 1,164-page chronology of every verified event in Lincoln's life. Ida Tarbell, the muckraking journalist of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, wrote a 4-volume biography. And Carl Sandburg wrote 6 volumes. Even larger is the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, 8 volumes edited by Ray P. Basler, compiling every word that Lincoln is verified to have written or said in a speech, a basic source for all modern biographies. Writing history is a relay, which is also true of history itself. We build, if we can, on the legacies that are left us.
Steve, that is beautiful. We are so with you on that, and we are delighted to help you with this relay. Ryan's and my organization goes back to 1845.
Wow.
Catherine and MHS goes back to 1791. So we are in the business of telling and then retelling and updating the stories of so many American men and women across all races. It's a journey. It's a scavenger hunt, as you 3 pointed out. And Steve, we thank you for all you are doing in your research and your writing. Your tellings of history, so valuable to us, especially with the pulpit that you have in those your great organization and how you get out there. So we're very, very grateful.